views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Blue Ridge PBS, the Virginia Department of Education, or the Virginia Society for Technology in Education. Blue Ridge PBS, in partnership with the Virginia Department of Education and in collaboration with VSTE, the Virginia Society for Technology in Education, is talking to leading educators about what gets them energized and how technology is being used to inspire student engagement. This is Activated Learning.
Blended learning at its core is just active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, with the goal of giving students more control over these four elements of their learning: time, place, pace, path.
Welcome to the very first episode of Activated Learning. I'm your host, Tom Landon, Director of Educational Innovation at Blue Ridge PBS. If you've been teaching or even sending your kids to school for more than a few years, you may feel like you and your kids are constantly subjected to new ways of teaching and learning that arrive with fanfare promising a revolution in education, only to be replaced by yet another, quote, game-changing program in a year or two. But my guest today represents a way of teaching and learning that really does appear to be here to stay. Dr. Catlin Tucker is truly a rock star in our profession. She's the author of many books, including Blended Learning, Activating Agency, Differentiation, Community, and Inquiry for Students, The Shift to Student-Led, Reimagining Classroom Workflows with UDL and Blended Learning, and her latest, Shift Writing into the Classroom, which she co-authors with her frequent collaborator, Dr. Katie Novak. She's also the host of her own popular podcast called The Balance and is a much sought-after keynote speaker. And we knew that she was the perfect guest to kick off the very first episode of Activated Learning. Welcome to Activated Learning.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start talking much about your work, I always like to start by asking people, what educational experiences stuck with you from your childhood? Is there anything that jumped out at you, either good or bad, that you made you maybe think about becoming an educator?
I never wanted to become an educator. So I don't have a lot of really powerful, positive memories from my own K-12 experience, as kind of sad as that sounds. I did have, when I was at UCLA doing my undergraduate work, some of my favorite classes. The best memories I had were those seminar classes where you'd sit around in circles and you would have read a text and we're talking about it and breaking it down. And the reason I loved those moments so much is I found it fascinating to listen to other people's perspectives and contrast them with my interpretations of what we had read or studied. And so for me, I went actually almost all the way through my undergrad, assuming I was going to law school like my mom, and made a last-minute pivot my senior year. And really, the question was, if I'm not going to go to law school and be an attorney like my mother, what am I going to do with this English degree? And I thought, maybe I'll be a teacher.
I mean, not to talk about myself much similar, I had a background in production, right? And then was a history minor. So when I realized that I didn't want to do video production for my whole life, my wife suggested I become a teacher. It never occurred to me before that I might make a teacher. So, your podcast, The Balance, everybody should listen to it. Everybody should subscribe. It's fantastic. And one of the episodes I listened to is with the co-author of your book, The Shift to Student-Led, Katie Novak. And one of the things that you talk about early is how maternity leave changed your perspective on teaching and learning. Tell me that story, if you would.
Sure. And I will just say, I feel like my entire journey in education is one happy accident after another, because literally from that senior year in college, I was going to graduate early and went to Ireland to work as a barista with my best friend. And it was on that trip traveling that I thought, I don't want to have the life that my mom has as an attorney. I want a life where I can write and I can travel and I can do all of these things. And that brought me to teaching. And then I entered teaching really excited, bright-eyed, 22-year-old, about creating this classroom that I had fantasized a lot about in credential school, where we were going to be sitting in circles and talking about literature and life and recreating the moments that clearly I had connected with so strongly in my college experience. I imagined kids just bounding through the door, eager, excited to learn. And then the reality was very different from my elaborate fantasies, as you can imagine. And I was at about year 5 or 6 and pretty disillusioned and tired and frustrated, and remember thinking, gosh, I may have made an enormous mistake coming into this profession. I'm tired. I don't feel like I'm successfully engaging students, getting them excited about learning. Should I find a different profession? What should I do? And it was at that moment I decided to have my first child, went on maternity leave, and it was in my year at home, or 17 months at home, where my interest in technology was piqued because I decided to teach some online college-level writing courses. My husband at the time was a teacher, so living on, one teacher's salary was not the most amazing experience. I figured I'd supplement and teach these online classes. And it was really in that moment of kind of working with students who range from 18 to like grandmas coming back for their degrees, entirely online, where I saw this potential for technology in the learning space in a way I had never experienced before. And so when my time as a stay-at-home mom was coming to an end, I literally skipped back in the classroom because that was no joke hard, and decided I'm going to give teaching one more year and just see, can I integrate some of these aspects of online learning that I do see a lot of potential in, even though I'm working in a very low-tech classroom with only devices in a handful of pockets, or a couple pockets coming through my classroom door each day. And the outcome of that experimentation, just treating my class like a laboratory and trying things and not worrying too much about outcomes, asking kids for feedback, definitely being really vulnerable as a risk taker. That's why I'm still in education today.
And that brings us to blended, which you have focused so much of your attention on. Before we talk about, how it fits with Universal Design for Learning. I was struck, as I learned more about blended several years ago, that you don't have to change everything you do in the classroom to incorporate so many of the great principles of blended learning. How do you, when you're talking to a faculty or a school division and you're trying to get them to promote this idea, how do you make them feel like it's not scary?
Any change is scary. Anything where teachers have to try something unfamiliar, or a new tech tool, instructional strategy or model, it's scary. It's daunting, right? Teachers like to be the experts. We like to feel confident that we know exactly what we're doing kind of before we do it. And this shift to blended learning really does require a degree of letting go of control and taking risks and potentially failing, which I always remind teachers that the more willing we are to be that lead learner in a classroom, experimenting, potentially failing, asking kids for feedback, what we're really doing is modeling that this is all natural parts of the learning process, and hopefully by extension help students to feel that it's safe for them to take risks, safe for them to potentially fail. So I like to acknowledge that, yeah, there is a degree of scariness when it comes to changing anything in terms of our established practice. But when I talk about blended learning, I like to remind teachers, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, especially after COVID, where that phrase was thrown around a lot, that blended learning at its core is just active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline, with the goal of giving students more control over these 4 elements of their learning: time, place, pace, path. And within that umbrella of blended learning, there's lots of different instructional models that give students different degrees of control over those 4 elements of their learning. And that can happen entirely in a classroom. It can happen on a hybrid schedule. It can also happen in an entirely remote learning scenario, which was maybe the most interesting part of my work during COVID, was realizing how beautifully these rotation models that teachers were using in classrooms worked in that remote learning scenario. And so, one, I think it's exciting to think of helping teachers cultivate this tool belt full of instructional models so they can start being much more intentional about what model am I selecting and how's it going to meet the needs of these learners and how's it going to free me to do what I need to do in this particular lesson. And those models, because they can work in any teaching and learning landscape, mean that if we build that proficiency, teachers should never be in a scenario like we were in with COVID, where we get thrown online and we're thinking, gosh, I have no idea how to do this. I'm not feeling successful. I don't have the strategy. So that's one. But then when my work with Dr. Novak, we kind of met, totally hit it off and decided to work together, it was also this acknowledgement that in a teacher-led, whole group, teacher-paced class, it is almost impossible to create equitable learning experiences. And so utilizing blended learning in combination with universal design for learning means that we can take those blended learning models, create flexible pathways to ensure that every learner is getting the input they need to reach a particular output or learning objective. So depending on the group I'm talking with, I might highlight or emphasize different aspects of that, but I think all of it's valuable when we talk about why would you shift to blended learning.
I didn't explain at the start of this, but I do have a little bell here on my desk, and this is the buzzword bell. And I'm going to hit, and it's meant to be done in kindness. But when there's a buzzword, this podcast will be listened to by parents. Not all parents know all these words we're talking about. So I'm going to gently hit the buzzword bell and just say, you've talked about universal design for learning. What's the short definition of it?
So if I was explaining this for parents, I would say when we talk about universally designing learning, what we're striving to do is design learning experiences that are inclusive, accessible, and equitable. And you might want to ring that bell again, because when we talk about equity, I think that's another one we have to kind of define, which is when we talk about equitable learning experiences or equity in education, I really focus on it's making sure that it's this acknowledgement, I guess, that individual learners do need individual inputs to reach a particular output. So some learners are going to need much more teacher time and energy to progress toward firm standard-aligned goals. Other students will need a lot less teacher time and energy. So how do we design learning experiences to ensure each student is getting what they need?
When we start talking about student choice, students be able to choose their own path in the classroom. That sounds awesome. It also sounds a little frightening, but one of the things that you sell it to us as, and it's a good sales job, is freeing up teacher time. And it's almost counterintuitive to someone who's spent time in a classroom that me giving the kids more agency is somehow not more work for me. How does that work? How's the magic work where giving students choices about how they're going to learn something they need to learn is actually a way to give yourself space to think more about teaching?
Yeah, well, it's that, but I also want to emphasize that giving students meaningful choices is maybe one of the best ways to remove barriers. So when we're thinking about what are the potential barriers that might make it challenging for a student to acquire information or complete a particular task, when we provide meaningful choices, we are allowing students to make decisions about what is going to work best for me as a learner. And the reality is, because a lot of teachers are like, but what if they make the wrong choice? Yeah, they absolutely will sometimes. And every wrong choice is an opportunity to learn more about ourselves as a learner.
Oh, that resonates so much. I mean, I thought when I was reading this, how many of your parents or how many of you have said these words as your children left the house, especially adolescent children? Make good choices, right? Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, they
That's
definitely
another teachable moment, right?
Absolutely, which is why I think pairing that ability to make choices with metacognitive processes and reflective processes is really important, because when we make a choice that didn't work and we all do it, we really do learn something about the next choice we're going to make, as long as we pause to really think about, why did I make that choice and why didn't it work very well for me, and what choice might I make in the future? So that's one piece that I think is really important. In terms of teacher time, when we allow students to make choices and kind of self-direct through a pathway that does not require that we orchestrate every moment of a lesson, we absolutely free ourselves during the lesson. Now, that's not to say there isn't that time investment on the front end to do the design work, right? So if we're going to create a choice board that moves students through a sequence of learning activities where they have multiple choices.
Choice board.
So a choice board, sometimes also referred to as a learning menu, is typically composed of multiple columns and rows. And the way I often talk about them is a choice board is a wonderful way to give students meaningful choice, give them different modalities, ways to work through particular types of learning tasks or focus on standards. So there's lots of different purposes that we might create a choice board for. You can have a choice board that's just review and practice, where students are selecting a certain number of items from the choice board to spend time on. You can have a choice board that is standard aligned, so each column aligns with a particular standard, and then within that column there might be 3 different ways students can engage with that particular standard or practice. So the idea is that it is actually this board with multiple options, and teachers can kind of identify how many of the different squares do students need to choose from. Do they have to go left to right, choose one from each column? So they're a nice way to position the student to control the pace of their learning to a higher degree, but also to have that agency over the path that they take through that learning activity.
And I should say that in this book are great examples. One of the things I love about this book is that in addition to really, first of all, fun writing, it's these guys, you can tell that these 2 doctors like each other a lot. And so you hear their voices while they're doing it. But at the end of every chapter and within the chapters are examples of everything she talks about. So I really, really appreciate. So when we talk about like universal design for learning and blended learning, what's the Venn diagram of those look like in terms of like where are they different? Where are they the same?
Yeah, so when we talk about that, so when Katie and I talk about blended learning in UDL, we like to call it like this power couple or dynamic duo, because universal design for learning, the beliefs at the core of it, of making learning inclusive and accessible and equitable, nobody argues with how important all of those things are. But it can feel very daunting to put into practice in a sustainable and consistent way. Blended learning and this kind of integration of active engaged learning online and offline without a higher purpose or without serving the kind of beliefs at the heart of UDL can sometimes feel like shallow technology integration. So in terms of the overlap, I would say the UDL is very much the core beliefs, the things, the values we want to put into practice, and blended learning offers the pathways to make that feel consistently manageable and sustainable. And yet when I would talk about, blended learning, some of the pillars of blended learning, like best practice, are things like student agency and meaningful choice, differentiation and personalization, control over the pace of learning. And all of those really are fundamental when we start thinking about what is universal design and how do we remove barriers and how do we support all students in making progress forward.
This is Activated Learning from Blue Ridge PBS in partnership with the Virginia Department of Education and in collaboration with VSTE. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Activated Learning wherever you get your podcasts. If you've got an idea for an upcoming show, let us know at activatedlearning@blueridgepbs.org.
As a former school administrator, as the director of instruction at Virtual Virginia for a while, what really would have gotten me excited about bringing this to my faculty is, and it's just those statistics, but you guys put it in such great perspective, and it has to do with the fact that how few of our students are actually reading at grade level, or maybe are, have the kind of literacy that they need to be successful, and just how when we assign reading, you've already put up a huge roadblock for kids. So what are some, when you have that issue in a classroom, and we all have that issue, I don't care what you teach, we all have that issue in our classroom. How does this approach, how is it, I'm not a magic bullet, but how does it really help with that? Giving those students more choices than just read this text because the standards say you will read this text.
Right. Well, and it's really important that students have access to grade level texts, even if they're not quite there yet. So then it becomes this question of how do we support them in accessing the information in that text, right? Because when they're little, they're learning to read, but when they're older, they're reading to learn. And if they can't read the text, then it makes it very hard for them to learn the content. So whether it is thinking, so often I worked in a high school English language arts class for 16 years. That was my teaching position. And I would routinely in my 9th and 10th grade English class have students who are reading, second language learners, at a 2nd, 3rd grade reading band level. I have to teach Lord of the Flies. So thinking about how do I make this accessible for students and using a variety of strategies. So in the early days, often it was me reading that chapter and recording it so a student could have that book open, be listening to my reading, tracking the words on the page. Sometimes it was having groups of kind of heterogeneous students together using a strategy like the reciprocal teaching strategy with the text so that they were reading sections, pausing, discussing it through a lens of a particular reading comprehension strategy so that they weren't by themselves unpacking that text and they weren't just relying on me to unpack it, which is what I see a lot when I'm coaching in classrooms, which is the teacher reading out loud for everybody because that way everybody can hear the text, but then the teacher's also pausing and identifying the main points and making the connections and asking the questions. And I'm like, who is doing the learning in this room, right? Like who's doing the heavy cognitive lift right now? It's the teacher, not the learner. So even though they may struggle to access that text, if we're teaching the reading strategies at the heart of a reciprocal teaching strategy, then they can start to build that stamina of engaging with grade level text while also having really robust peer support in that group. And maybe there's even a group who they have the text, but they're listening to the audio and pausing and having that conversation. So really, it's as designers of learning experiences, are we constantly thinking proactively about what might a barrier be and how do I try to remove it in the way I'm designing these learning experiences?
Well, and the idea that, we can group our kids and that takes care of it is, as I read this and I thought about my own learning experience and I thought, there were days, I'm an excellent reader, I'm a very good reader, but there were days when I probably wasn't, who knows what had happened in my life, swim meet the day before, something going on at home. Not that this happened to me in school, but girlfriend trouble. So it's the idea that I guess, maybe you can talk a little more about the idea that it's everybody as a learner is fluid in some ways, right?
Well, and I think I love to read too, and I'm a strong reader as well, but I like to read certain things. Reading is a really personal endeavor, and I'm not sure if it's this book or the previous one, but I write about the fact that
they all run together, right? Because you've written so many.
We have a third one coming out in January. I'm in a book club. I'm in the book club, so I have an excuse to drink wine and see my friends once a month. That is kind of the most powerful reason I joined the book club. And each month we get to choose a book. And so every 3 books, I really enjoy one of our reads. I always read the other ones because I am an English, former English teacher, and I think they expect a little bit for me to bring it in the book club meetings. But I just read the books because I want to drink wine and chat with my friends, but I'm not huge into sci-fi. I don't even really like nonfiction. Definitely not a self-help girl. But you give me historical fiction, you give me regular fiction, and I am there for a lot of it. Yet in schools, what we do when we ask students to read is we're like, okay, everybody is reading this short story because we need to talk about theme and how you identify one and track its development over the course of a story. And I finally got to a place where I was like, why do we have to read the same short story? Why can't I give students options of 4 or 5 different stories? Say, hey, which of these sound, little synopsis of the story do you want to, sounds interesting, would you like to read that short story? Because we can all work on identifying a theme and tracking its development. We don't have to read the same short story. And so for me, again, it's also just kind of pulling back and thinking about maybe the interest or the type of reading is actually the barrier.
Right. Obvious. It sounds obvious, right? But we don't think about that all the time. Little shift here, but it is December in Virginia. We are in the mountains. It's a foggy morning outside the day we're recording this. I start to think about snow days, and both how nice they can be for teachers and students, but also how, because of the shift to remote during the pandemic, for many of us, there's no such thing as a snow day anymore. Now they're called a remote day. And how does your work help us as teachers and administrators and things have a meaningful plan? Because we can have a snow day plan, we can have a remote plan, but does it check the boxes of the same instruction we're going to be doing in the classroom? So just give me a little bit of that. Like, I know you've thought about this.
I have, but I also know that the snow day is a very sensitive subject. I don't have any of those in California. Now we have smoke days for wildfires, but I was listening to a whole thing where people were like, snow days are special, don't take away our snow days. So I'm going to answer this without taking a position on the snow day. I will say there are a lot of reasons why blended learning could be helpful when school is interrupted. So actually a lot of my work is international, where it might be weather related, it might be climate related, like climate crisis kind of related, it might be political upheaval, right? I was in Kenya, I want to say a month and a half ago, and they were coming off of a few months before, like a pretty volatile election. And so this idea that kids were going to have to stay home, the streets might not be safe. Like, there are a lot of reasons all over the world why school might be interrupted. Fire days in California, snow days on the East Coast. And for me, I don't really see why that needs to create this kind of abrupt stop to learning, right? So whether we have, in our back pocket kind of a snow day playlist that is a self-paced experience. If I'm an elementary teacher, maybe it has to do with observations related to the fact that kids are home on a snow day, or giving them resources to understand weather patterns. But most of us at the secondary level, we have some kind of learning management system, Google Classroom or Canvas or Schoology or something. There's no reason why we can't actively engage students online, whether it's having them watch or read something and engage in an asynchronous discussion, whether it's providing a choice board related to what we're doing and having them select certain items. So I think the more comfortable we are utilizing technology to actively engage students online, the easier it is to kind of shift much more fluidly between an in-person experience and an online experience. The thing that I would say, though, is when we have students who are at home, not forgetting to push them off the screen, have them engage in that tactile, experiential, social learning. I think one of the misconceptions about me, because of my interest in blended learning and being so published on the topic, is that I must just love technology. I am just as excited about offline learning as online learning. I think it's the combination that is particularly powerful. So whether we're pushing students offline to do field work, make observations, interview somebody in their home environment, those things to me are equally as important to keep in mind when students are learning at home. And because they can document and share their learning in lots of different ways, that shouldn't create a barrier either.
Understanding, and I know you know this, understanding that there are barriers that many of our students face when they're not in the safe form space of school. obviously.
Which brings homework right to the forefront of the conversation sometimes.
Let's talk about homework a little bit. Is there a place for it?
I'll just be frank. The longer I spend in education and then definitely becoming a parent, the less excited I am to send kids home with work after they've spent 7 hours at school. You know, when my kids were younger, and I want to say especially around the 3rd, 4th grade year, I was like, they spent all day in school and now they're coming home and my little 3rd and 4th grader has like 90 minutes of stuff that they're being asked to do. And like, all I want them to do is go outside and be kids and relax and get a brain break. So my feelings about homework from that perspective definitely started to shift. And there's a lot of research, you know, if you're thinking about, is homework really effective in bolstering those skills? Not necessarily. And there's huge equity issues when we send homework home with kids because we are making a lot of assumptions about their environment, levels of support, access, and all those things concern me. Actually, the book coming out is about shifting writing across the curriculum into the classroom, because when the ChatGPT thing erupted and people were like, it's the end of writing an essay. I'm like, yeah, if you send it home with them, probably. Like, you're sending home prompts they don't care about. They just want to get through it. Sure, who's not going to lean on something to get through that process that they're not invested in more quickly? But it's also just, why are we sending such cognitively challenging tasks home? And I would argue the reason teachers feel compelled to send so much practice and application home is because we're still spending lion's share of our time with kids talking at them in the classroom instead of engaging them in that active learning.
So much of what you write about and talk about is that shift from what can I do to what can my students do?
Yep.
And as someone who has implemented some of this and seen it well implemented in many places around the country, that phrase has a lot packed into it. What does it mean to you? What can I do versus what can my students do?
Yeah, that is actually one of the tips that I give the teachers I coach and train, which is, as teachers, we are constantly striving to do the very best job we can for students. And so we're always asking the how can I question. And you'll hear this in my keynote if you join me tomorrow morning, which is, how can I get my students writing more? How can I communicate more with my students' families? How can I build more projects into my curriculum? The problem with the how can I question is it positions us to do the work. So whenever we're tempted to ask the how can I question, I encourage my teachers to pause, take a breath, reframe. How can my students? So if it's how can my students communicate more with their families about their progress, that's a very different answer. And then the question becomes, how do I as the teacher support students and help them to communicate more effectively with families? How do I build that into the classroom? What supports and scaffolds might they need to make that happen? What tools might we utilize to make that happen? So that shift is really about helping students to be our true partners in the learning journey, right? Because if we are carrying the lion's share of the load and students are kind of these passive observers for a lot of a class, there's no way to find balance in this work. There's no way to have that practice feel sustainable. We have to engage students in every part of the learning process.
Another thing that struck me is your acronym RAFT, Role, Audience, Format, Task, in terms of helping students figure out what their work is. And it occurred to me, this is something I do every day. You know, I have to think about what is my role in a production, like a podcast. You know, who is it for? How do you get kids to think about that, and teachers to think about this idea of role, audience, format, and task?
So one of the things that I just want to acknowledge, because it's a reality, is that being a student in a student-centered classroom as opposed to a teacher-centered classroom is much more challenging, cognitively and socially.
For the students.
For the students. And so as teachers, when we use something like a RAFT acronym, well, first from a teacher perspective, it's like, well, if we're asking students to assume a role, can we make sure we're asking them to assume a role in a more authentic kind of context, right, as they approach a particular task instead of just saying, hey, I want you to do this. Then you have things like audience, where for a lot of teachers, they've been the only audience. So for students, they're like, what do you mean audience? You're my audience, right? Like, you asked for this, I'm going to give it to you. You're going to grade it. Instead, thinking about what are all the potential audiences that could be appropriate for this particular piece, right? So one of the chapters that we write about in the shift is about moving from that audience of one teacher to really thinking about creating authentic audiences, and how do we help students to identify who might be a good audience for this particular piece of work that I'm engaged with, because the more authentic that audience, the more likely students are to invest their time and energy in it. And format, tasks, so again, all of those things could involve really meaningful choices from a student perspective, but they will be daunted at first because they have very little practice making those kinds of decisions or thinking about those aspects of the learning experience, because classically, students are kind of told, here's what you're going to study, here's how you're going to do it, this is what I need you to create to demonstrate your learning, and they're kind of going through the motions without doing that higher level thinking about those kinds of aspects of the work.
I just want to emphasize, the fact that you titled this The Shift to Student-Led just implies it's not happening all at once, right? This is a process that we all hopefully will go through over time. Catlin, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here at VSTE, and to all of you in the audience and those of you listening at home for Activated Learning. I'm Tom Landon.
Activated Learning was created by Blue Ridge PBS in partnership with the Virginia Department of Education and in collaboration with the Virginia Society for Technology and Education. Produced by Tom Landon, Director of Educational Innovation at Blue Ridge PBS, with a lot of help from graphic and audio designer Jay Prater, podcast studio producers Andy Depew and Kurt Schruth, and Vice President of Education Dr. Rose Martin. Our theme music was composed and produced by Ryan Champney and Dr. Matt Katatachea of VSTE. Copyright 2023, Blue Ridge PBS.